There are no more names, no prayers, no voices left to carry the old stories. The forest still breathes, but now it listens. Welcome to SpookyShade, where we tell not what happened, but what still echoes. This is part 4, The Seeds Beyond Language. A world reborn without words. A memory that no longer belongs to anyone. And a child who speaks without sound, but is heard by everything. Tonight, don't expect answers. Expect possibility.
Part 4. The Seeds Beyond Language. It started with the water, not the trees, not the roots, not the dreams, but the rivers. They began to move strangely, not upstream, not downstream, just towards something. Across deltas, under bridges, through the canals of old cities and the veins of new ones, water began to flow in curves, glyphs written in liquid. People didn't notice at first. They thought it was rain, seasonal change, faulty irrigation. But the children saw it. They watched puddles form into spirals. They traced the shapes with their fingers. And then they began to repeat words no one remembered teaching them. A girl in the southern lowlands whispered into a riverbank. "You used to carry prayers." The water rippled once, then rose. Not as a wave, as an answer. In the highlands, an elder drowned with a smile on his face. They pulled him from the stream, thinking it was tragedy. But his lips still moved underwater, repeating a name over and over. Ishel, Ishel, Ishel. No one knew who that was, until the river changed course overnight and flooded the old graveyards. At the edge of the reclaimed city once called Barapur, now known only by a gesture, a hand pressed to the chest, palm open, a new temple was built. But there were no statues, no altars, just a bowl of river water that never evaporated. Pilgrims came from far away to speak into it. They didn't pray. They didn't plead. They asked, and sometimes it answered. Avia sat beside the water one evening, her knees in the mud, watching the way the current curved without force. She was older now, taller, but the flower behind her ear never wilted. It was made of memory, after all, not matter. She whispered. Is she still listening? The water trembled. Then it stilled. Then, softly. Yes, but she no longer listens like a god. She listens like the wind, and the wind will carry what you dare to say. Avia lowered her eyes, not in reverence, in acceptance, because she knew now. They hadn't inherited a new religion. They had inherited a living response, a conversation older than speech, one carved by silence, and carried by rivers that remember where blood once ran. They weren't afraid of the roots, not like their parents were, not like those who lived through the blooming, or the silence, or the mirror years. The children of this world had never known silence. They were born into a planet where the soil responded, where the air whispered names, and where water flowed in sentences. So they did what children always do with what they're born into. They tested it. In a school carved from living wood, under a canopy that shifted with the seasons of memory, a boy named Riken asked a question. Not out loud. He scratched it into the skin of a tree during his lesson. What if the memories are wrong? The bark didn't answer. Not immediately. But that night, Riken dreamed of a city made of salt, and a man who carried books filled with names that changed every time they were read. He woke up gasping, and on the wall above his bed, scrawled in sap, were 3 words. Ask again tomorrow. In another village, a girl named Salvi held a beetle in her palm. She asked it, "Who made you remember to walk?" The beetle turned 3 times and crawled up her wrist, and for a moment she saw through its eyes. A field of fire, a voice saying go, in silence that smelled like ash. Salvi blinked, then whispered, "That wasn't mine." The children met once a cycle, not in temples, not in squares, but in a clearing where no trees grew. It was the only place the roots didn't enter. They called it the mouthless circle. There, they shared their questions, not just about the world, but about truth itself. Was remembering always healing? Could the forest lie? Did Aranya choose to become what she became, or was she chosen? These were not heresies. Not anymore. They were called counter-memories. And the forest listened. Sometimes it rustled violently. Sometimes it went quiet for days. But it never struck. It learned. Because even the oldest roots had never heard children say, "We forgive you, but we don't believe you yet." And so the vines began to adapt. Not grow, not consume, but change. Some curled away from the temples. Some unraveled old altars. Some whispered different names. Names even the forest didn't remember planting. In the sky, a storm brewed over the mirror tree. The petals on its crown fell one by one. Each one carried a word, and every child who caught one forgot a memory that had never belonged to them. For the first time in centuries, the balance shifted again. Not toward gods, not toward humans, but toward those brave enough to ask, why do we keep remembering what made us afraid to live? She was born on a windless night. No leaves moved. No roots stirred. No water whispered. And that, more than anything, was the omen. Because in a world where everything spoke, her birth was the first true silence the forest had heard in 100 years. They named her. Nothing. Not in cruelty, but in awe. Because every name they offered, the child rejected. Not with tantrums. Not with tears. But with absence. When they called her Lyra, the vines near her cradle withered. When they tried Naeli, the air went still. And when they tried Orania, the forest recoiled. The elders gathered beneath the canopy of the mirror tree. The petals had stopped falling. The waters ran backward for 3 breaths. And then a root grew up from the ground and rode in the soil. She does not remember. Because she was not given memory. She is not ours. She is yours. They called her the unrooted. She grew faster than most. She did not hear the trees. She did not dream other lives. She did not know the sorrow in the soil. But she watched. She listened. She asked. And one day, when she was no longer a baby, but not yet a girl, she looked into the mouth of the river and said, I don't remember what I forgot. Does that mean it was never mine? The river did not answer. But the water bent. It bowed. In schools carved from singing stone, the children asked, if she has no memory, what does she carry? The answer came not from roots, not from elders, but from her. She spoke for the first time in the mouthless circle. I carry space. For what? For what has never been spoken. The children stared. One boy cried, not because he was afraid, but because he felt, for the first time, unscripted, like he didn't have to repeat someone else's grief. The forest did not attack her, nor did it welcome her. It simply watched, because in her it saw something terrifying. Not forgetting, but freedom from the need to remember. One night, Avia stood near her sleeping form. She whispered to the wind, is she a blessing? The wind replied, she is the question that comes after forgiveness. And somewhere in the deep soil beneath the mirror tree, where no light or sound had reached for decades, a new seed cracked open, not from grief, not from history, but from pure, utter possibility. It began with shapes, not letters, not words, but movements in space. When she wanted to say sun, she would raise her hands in a slow spiral, like warmth crawling over skin. When she felt sadness, she didn't lower her eyes. She cupped her palm behind her neck and exhaled through her fingers. No one taught her. No one corrected her. And yet, they began to understand. The children were the first to imitate her, not out of reverence, but out of relief, because her language had no room for guilt. It didn't ask who you were. It didn't care who you buried. It had no memory, only moment. She spoke without sound, but every gesture she made carried meaning that landed inside the body, not just the ear. And those who saw her movements described it like being reminded of something you never knew. The elders were skeptical. Some said her language was dangerous. A child without memory, without roots, now creating a system beyond the forest reach? If she names the world, one whispered, she may name things that should never wake. But Avia watched from afar and said only, no, she's naming what never had the chance to be. On the 100th night since her first wordless gesture, the unrooted stood in the mouthless circle. Around her, dozens of children knelt in silence. They waited. She raised her hand and moved. One finger across her chest, another across her shadow, and tapped once. Not on herself, but on the air. That movement meant, I am here, and I am not borrowed. The forest did not stir. It paused, because this language, this gesture, was not translatable. There were no roots in it, no loops, no cycles, no echo. It was forward only, and in the mirrored groves where Aranya once walked, where Thamarai once wept, the trees leaned just slightly away, as if realizing something profound and frightening. The world would no longer be remembered. It would now be rewritten. The next morning, the river changed direction, not because of erosion, but because the girl had named it differently, and it had listened. They were always there, in the corners of the sky that never held stars, in the spaces between trees where shadows bent the wrong way, in the pause between two breaths. Things not evil, not divine, just unnamed. Before the unrooted, the world had no room for them. Everything was traced back, spoken into being through bloodlines, through symbols passed from mouth to mouth, memory to root. To not be remembered was to not exist. But now, existence had changed, and the unnamed began to stir. They didn't roar. They didn't rise. They revealed, in subtle, eerie ways. One morning, a village awoke to find an extra hill where none had been. When walked upon, it made no sound. A woman plucked a fruit from a tree that no one remembered planting. Inside was a single human tooth, still warm. Children pointed to holes in the sky and said, "That's where they sleep when we speak too much." The forest didn't recognize them. The rivers didn't reflect them. The dreams didn't hold them, because these were not forgotten things. They were never-known things. And the unrooted. She named them, not with words, but with movements that had no memory. One gesture bent light. Another calmed wind. A slow circle with the wrist made a stone shiver, as if recognizing its own fear. One night, she stood in the mouthless circle and made a motion no one had seen before. A spiral. Then a pause. Then her hands pressed flat to the ground. The earth breathed in, and something not animal, not God, not tree, rose from beneath the soil. It was made of possibility, eyes like empty rooms, flesh that shimmered with questions. The children did not scream. They knelt, because they understood. This was not a monster. It was a sentence that had never been finished. And she, this girl without a past, had completed it. Avia watched from the distance, heart pounding. She turned to the old mirror tree and whispered, "The world is changing." The mirror replied, "No, it's just becoming itself. For the first time. Without us." It didn't move like anything they had seen before. Not on legs. Not with rhythm. Not with intent. It simply occurred. Wherever it was, the world reworded itself around it. Walls curved. Roads coiled. Time hesitated. Birds avoided the air above it. Roots beneath it retracted in awe. Children stared, not in fear, but in recognition, because somehow they understood. This is not something new. This is something that never had permission to arrive until now. The unrooted walked beside it. She didn't lead. She didn't follow. She simply moved in tandem, making gestures with her hands that softened the ground, cooled the wind, slowed the watching sky. And the sentence responded, not by speaking, but by modifying reality. Where it passed, forgotten animals re-emerged, blinking under sun they'd never seen. Old machines, rusted and useless, lit up for one final breath. A mountain collapsed into flowers, each petal bearing a symbol no one could translate. Avia, now a voice for the Forest Council, called an emergency gathering. "There is no record of this," she said. One elder replied, "Of course not. There was nothing to remember." Another asked, "Can we contain it?" And the youngest of them whispered, almost in hope, "Should we?" For generations, they had lived in a world ruled by memory. Now something had arrived that had never been remembered. It was not bound by grief, ritual, or song. It did not honor the blooming. It wrote forward, and with each step it took, it reshaped what could be. One night, the sentence entered a village with no name. The people didn't ask it to bless them. They simply offered it something they had never dared give anyone. An unfinished story. No beginning. No characters. Just a few lines. We saw the wind take shape. And it did not become a god. It became us. The sentence stood still. Then it folded its shape into that story. And disappeared. The next morning, the village awoke to find themselves changed. They could no longer speak the old languages. They could no longer remember their ancestors. But they could see further. And they could name things that had never existed. They were no longer villagers. They were now called authors. The first sign was subtle. A tree failed to whisper. No root recoiled at footsteps. No petal curled at the name Aranya. No bark exhaled dust when asked a question. Just silence. Then came the second. The mirror tree stopped reflecting. Not shattered. Not blinded. Just still. As though it no longer saw anything worth showing. The forest had always been the memory of the world. It remembered wars by the way its leaves darkened. It remembered songs through the cadence of wind. It remembered pain in the color of moss. But now, it looked at the world it had kept alive so long and saw something new. They do not need me anymore. In the grove of names, the bark began to smooth. Generations of lineage once etched in language were slowly vanishing. Not erased. Not destroyed. Just let go. The unrooted stood beneath the last singing vine. She placed her hand against it. No song came. Only warmth. Only a thrum, like a body finally at rest. Avia returned to the grove days later and knelt beside her. The roots aren't answering. The unrooted nodded, then moved her hand slowly through the air. A new motion. A new word. No one understood it fully, but they felt it. It meant, let them sleep. And so the forest did. Trees stopped reacting to memory. Rivers flowed as rivers again. The wind blew without carrying names. The world did not collapse. It simply shifted, as though it had taken a deep breath and exhaled everything it no longer needed to carry. But in that exhale, something began to stir. A space. A silence not filled by forgetting, but by possibility. The sentence that walked had not returned, but its path remained. And wherever it had passed, the trees grew taller, but quieter. The roots dug deeper, but without weeping. And beneath it all, the earth hummed a tune that had no lyrics, because what was coming next was not what had been, but what had never been allowed to be. No one saw it arrive, because it did not come from anywhere. It simply began to be, at the center of a clearing that had never held trees, where no root dared grow, where no shadow had ever settled. It appeared, not in a burst, not in a bloom, but like a pause between thoughts stretched long enough to take form. It had no eyes, no limbs, no outline that stayed still. Sometimes it shimmered like heat. Sometimes it pulsed like breath. Sometimes it resembled someone you almost remembered but never truly knew. The children called it If, not a name, a question, because that's all it ever felt like. What if we had not forgotten? What if we had never been born? What if nothing had ever happened, and yet here we still were? The unrooted stood before it for hours. It didn't move. Neither did she. But the space between them rippled, as if the world was trying to write a sentence. And failing. In the sky, the clouds changed shape. Not into animals, not into gods, but into ideas that hadn't been imagined yet. And then they rained. A soft fall of clear droplets that turned into dust the moment they touched anything that had a name. Avia was summoned by the council. What is it? They asked. But even the forest no longer answered. So she said, slowly, I think it's not a being. Then what? It's the shadow of everything we never became. As she spoke, the shape turned. Not physically, but conceptually. And for the first time, it offered something. A gesture, not one the unrooted had invented, not one recorded in the old signs. A gesture that had never been seen. A spiral inward. Then a break. Then a stillness so deep it felt like the silence before time. And then it vanished, leaving no footprints. Only a ring of space in the soil where nothing would grow. But people stood at the edge and whispered. I think I felt myself being rewritten. The forest did not respond. The rivers did not speak. But the air shimmered, just enough to say, something new has entered, and it has no memory of us. Old ones, cracked ones, forgotten ones. They didn't reflect anymore. Not properly. Instead of showing the people who stood before them, they showed an absence. Not black, not shadow, just a soft distortion like heat on metal. And in that distortion, one could see themselves as they might have been. A man saw himself with a different name. A woman saw the child she never had. A child saw a version of their own face, not yet shaped by grief. And across the world, one shared feeling spread. I am being watched by what I could have been. The forest knew it. Though it no longer remembered why it feared mirrors, it shivered. Rivers turned glassy. Leaves curled inward. Even the sentence that walked paused on its path and trembled, just once. Because something was now moving without origin. It had no backstory, no myth, no anchor, and it had begun to notice the world. They called it nothing, not out of disrespect, but because there was no better word. It was the shape they couldn't define, the moment between inhale and exhale, the echo before the first sound. And now it looked back. In the mouthless circle, the unrooted sat in silence. Children gathered around her. None of them spoke, not because they couldn't, but because they wanted to hear what silence might say back. And in that silence, the air shifted. Not violently, not ominously, just deeply, like the world was acknowledging them for the first time without using memory to do it. Avia watched from the edge of the grove. The sky above her had no stars that night, but one small dot of non-light pulsed above the clearing. And she felt it, not in her skin, not in her breath, but in her possibility. Something that never was, now sees me. The next morning, Story stopped working. Not forever. just for a moment. A boy tried to tell the tale of Aranya, but couldn't remember the ending. An elder sang the names of the roots, and the roots didn't respond. Not out of anger, but out of disinterest. Because now, a new presence was watching, and it did not care who he had been, only who he might become. It started in the highlands, villages where wind had always sung through the rice stalks, whistled against woven rooftops, and whispered the names of ancestors into children's ears as they slept. But one morning, the wind was still there. It moved. It touched. It cooled. But it said nothing. An elder named Keshel was the first to notice. He stood before his doorway, opened his arms to greet the morning as always, and said, "Who do you bring me today?" The wind brushed past his face, through his palms, around his body. But it brought no name, not even his own, not even the name of the field where his wife was buried. Just silence. Soon it spread, through the south marshes, the echo cities, the bone gardens. The wind moved, but did not recognize. And so, neither did the people. Without names on the wind, conversations thinned, not out of fear, but from dissolution. People began to forget not who they were, but that they had ever needed names in the first place. Children pointed to one another and smiled with gestures. Lovers touched foreheads instead of saying, "I missed you." The dead were buried not with titles, but with gestures of breath and open palms. The unrooted sat beneath the last listening tree. Its branches, once filled with the murmurs of the wind's stories, now hung quiet. She raised her hand slowly, forming a shape not seen before. One arc, one twist, one pause over the heart. The tree did not respond, but something did. A breath, not the wind, but something beneath it. Older, calmer, wordless. It pressed gently into her mind, not like language, not like memory, but like a thought that was never taught, only shared. "Do you still need to be called to be real?" She lowered her hands and wept, not from grief, but from recognition. The next day, people awoke and spoke less, not from silence, from sufficiency. The wind passed overhead. It no longer remembered their names, but they no longer needed it to. In Barivpur's ruins, a wall once carved with all the names of the lost began to flake. Not rot, not shatter, just slowly like dust. And at its center, where the first name, Aranya, had been etched deep into the stone, a flower bloomed, rootless, red, breathing. They gathered not to listen, but to witness. The unrooted stood in the middle of the mouthless circle, surrounded by the children, the elders, the silence, the soil. The wind did not speak. The trees did not sway. Even the river had gone still, because something was about to be spoken for the last time. Not the end of a world, but the end of narrative itself. She did not use words. She never had. But every hand, every breath, every movement she made became a glyph of presence, a moment made physical. She danced the death of memory. She signed the birth of the untold. She turned once, and a generation wept without understanding why. And then, she stopped, held out both arms, and from her chest, a breath. Not exhaled, not voiced, just released. And in that breath, the story bloomed. No one heard it. No one repeated it. But they all felt it. A child born before time began, who walked without name, who found a seed in the mouth of silence, and planted it in a place that had never been described. And from that seed, a forest grew that never needed to remember what it used to be. When the story ended, no one clapped, no one bowed. They simply stood, and in their bodies, in their skin, in the unspoken rooms of their thought, they carried the story without holding it. The mirror tree dropped its final petal. The sentence that walked knelt before the circle and dissolved into air. The wind circled once, then disappeared into itself. And in the empty sky above them all, a new star did not appear. Instead, the sky itself breathed. And so it was. There were no more stories after that. Not because none could be told, but because none needed to be. End of Part 4, The Seeds Beyond Language.